She looked me in the eye and said, "You don't deserve any of it." I didn't flinch. I just slid the envelope across the table and said, "We'll see what the court says." I'm Evelyn. 31. And up until the day my aunt locked me out of my grandmother's house, I still believed in keeping peace with family, even when they didn't deserve it. I thought patience was strength. I thought loyalty meant silence. I was wrong. My grandmother Margaret was everything to me. Not just the woman who raised me when my own mother couldn't, but the compass for everything I believe in. She was steady, dignified, and impossible to fool. She believed in clean floors, strong coffee, and earned respect. She used to say, "Don't confuse noise with power, Evelyn. Real strength doesn't need an audience." After she passed, I didn't cry in public. I stayed behind to collect her rosary from the hospital bed and fold the cardigan she always kept on the back of her chair. I arranged the funeral, took the calls, and made sure everyone had a place to sit during the service. Everyone except me, apparently. Because the morning after we buried her, I drove back to her house, the house I'd helped maintain for years, and found the locks changed. My Aunt Marian was waiting on the porch like a cat that had just eaten something alive. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just turned her face toward the rose bushes I planted 2 summers ago and said, "Estate matters are being handled. You're not needed here." That was the moment everything changed. Until then, I'd made every excuse for her behavior. The entitlement, the manipulation, the way she always managed to twist my grandmother's generosity into an obligation. I'd told myself it was grief. Or resentment. Or just bad communication. But that morning, standing in front of the house I'd spent half my life protecting from rot and rain, I understood, Marian had no intention of honoring my grandmother's will. And worse, she had help. The lawyer my grandmother trusted, Mr. Dawes, had passed away just months before she did. His replacement was a man I'd never heard of. My cousin Jared, Marian's son, had recently started working at a real estate development firm downtown, and suddenly there were whispers of selling the property, liquidating assets, and reallocating funds. Funds, mind you, that had been promised to me since I was 17. Not out of pity. Not out of convenience. But in writing. In Margaret's own words, sealed and signed. The original trust had named me as the sole heir to her primary residence, her art collection, and a portion of her investment account. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to make my future secure. Enough to acknowledge what I had given up to care for her. But when I asked Marian to review the documents, she laughed. Not a full laugh. Just that dismissive breath people use when they want to make you feel small. She said, "Sweetheart, you must have misunderstood. The trust was amended. Everything now falls under my name as executor. You know how these things go." I didn't say anything then. I just walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat, staring at my hands on the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the nausea. I knew what she was doing. I just didn't know how far she'd go. Later that week, a letter arrived, formal, thick paper, notarized, stating that I had no current rights to the estate and should refrain from attempting to enter the property again without written consent. It was signed by Marian's lawyer. And CC'd to the firm where Jared worked. I felt something inside me split, not just anger, but grief. Not for the loss of money or property, but for the betrayal. For the years I spent brushing my grandmother's hair, managing her appointments, paying bills from my own paycheck when her pension ran short. For the nights I slept on the floor of her hospital room because Marian was always too tired to come. I let it burn. Quietly. Carefully. Because I knew something Marian didn't. I had a copy of the original trust. And I had kept the last letter my grandmother ever wrote me, handwritten, folded into the back of a recipe book she knew I'd eventually open. In it, she wrote, "You were the only one who showed up when it counted. I can't promise what they'll try to take from you. But I know you have the strength to protect what matters." I read it 3 times before picking up the phone. And that's when I called Lydia. Lydia wasn't just a friend, she was a probate lawyer. We met 5 years ago when I was volunteering at a community legal clinic, and we'd kept in touch over coffee and case notes. When I told her everything, she didn't react the way I expected. No outrage. No dramatic gasps. Just a slow, deliberate question. Do you want to fight this? I answered without hesitation, yes. And with that, everything I'd spent years suppressing, the compliance, the guilt, the blind loyalty, began to peel away like old wallpaper. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead. I was going to make them prove, line by line, why they thought they could erase me. Because Marion may have changed the locks. But she had no idea what I'd already unlocked. I never wanted her money. I just wanted the truth honored. The days that followed were silent in all the worst ways. No more condolence calls. No casseroles left on the porch. Just the occasional ping of a forwarded email from Lydia and the quiet thrum of my own thoughts, circling the same wound. How did we end up here? The answer, of course, went back further than I liked to admit. When I was 9, my mother disappeared for 6 months. No letter. No explanation. Just gone. I remember standing on the porch in my school shoes, watching Margaret scrape frost from the windshield of her Buick, telling me to grab my backpack. She said, "Don't worry about anything but the next right thing." That became the rhythm of our life, me and her, day by day, scraping things clean. She taught me how to make tea properly, how to fold towels like a hotel, and how to speak with dignity even when people were trying to shame you. She never criticized my mother, not directly. But I saw the quiet disappointment in the way she organized her spice rack after a phone call that ended too quickly. Marion, on the other hand, was always circling. Not quite present, but not gone either. She floated in like weather, beautiful, chaotic, and completely unpredictable. She had a knack for showing up only when Margaret was well enough to entertain guests, and disappearing the moment something real was required. I remember the first time I saw the estate folder. I was 16, sitting at the dining table doing algebra, and Margaret pulled a thick manila envelope from her locked drawer. She said, "This will all make sense someday. Just remember, there's a difference between blood and behavior." I didn't understand the weight of that at the time. But I do now. Margaret wasn't a woman who made decisions lightly. When she added me to the trust, she wasn't being sentimental. She was being practical. I was the one who drove her to her doctor appointments, managed the house when her hip gave out, filed her taxes when her arthritis got too bad to hold a pen. I didn't do it for reward. I did it because it was right. But Marion never saw that. To her, love was a currency. Something you earned with charm or traded in return for attention. She called Margaret Maggie even when asked not to. She wore stilettos on the garden path and complained when they sank into the soil. She bragged about her husband's watch collection, but never once asked Margaret how her blood pressure was holding. The contrast between us grew sharper every year. When I was 23, Margaret fell and fractured her pelvis. Marion flew in for 3 days, made a show of bringing lavender lotion and ordering catered soup. She took photos of herself beside Margaret's hospital bed and posted them with long captions about family first. Then she flew back to Charleston for a wine-tasting weekend. I stayed. Bathed her. Dressed her. Helped her relearn how to get from bed to chair without crying out. And never once did I ask her for anything in return. She must have seen that. I know she did. Because a year later, she called me into the sunroom and said, "I updated the trust. You'll need to know where everything is." I remember the light through the curtains. The tea cooling beside us. The way her voice cracked just slightly on the word everything. She didn't want a fight. She wanted peace, even if it meant trusting the law more than her own daughter. I suppose that's what breaks my heart now. That she saw this coming. I couldn't tell Lydia any of this. Not in detail. But she didn't need it. She understood the shape of it, how many twists people who were already warped long before $1 was on the table. She said, we'll need the original documents, proof of your involvement, and any communications you have from your grandmother about the estate. I brought her a cardboard box the next morning. Receipts, calendars, medical notes, handwritten lists. A decade of quiet service catalogued in ink and sweat, and Sunday afternoons spent scrubbing tile grout while Marion was tagging herself at rooftop brunches. Lydia looked through the first few items and nodded slowly. This is good, she said. This is very good. I didn't feel relief. Just a deeper ache. As if proving my worth required evidence. As if memory alone wasn't enough. By the third day, Lydia had drafted a petition to freeze the estate until the trust could be verified. It was the first real step toward protecting what was left of Margaret's legacy, and mine. I knew Marion would retaliate. She never let a mirror stay cracked without trying to break it completely. Sure enough, that night, I got a call from my cousin Jared. He said, "You're making this ugly, Evelyn." I replied, "No. I'm just not letting you bury it pretty." There was a long silence. Then he muttered something about loyalty, and how this wasn't what Grandma would have wanted. I didn't argue. People like him aren't looking for answers, just obedience. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen and stared at the old recipe box on the counter. Margaret's handwriting, still neat even in her final years, labeled every divider with practical categories: breads, casseroles, cakes. In the back, under a card for lemon bars, was the letter she'd written me the year before she died. Evelyn. If you're reading this, then something has gone sideways. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Marion surprises you. But just in case she doesn't, remember what I said. This family loves performance, not substance. You were never meant to play the part. You were meant to live the truth. Keep your dignity. And if they try to take what's yours, make them do it in court, not behind closed doors. Love, always, M. I folded the letter back into the box and stood up. There was no more waiting. Tomorrow, Lydia would file the motion. And the next time Marion tried to silence me, she'd be speaking into a judge's microphone. But that night, before I turned off the kitchen light, I walked through Margaret's bedroom one more time in my mind. The scent of lavender. The chair by the window. The feeling of being seen without needing to explain. And something shifted in me. Not a decision. Not a plan. Just a quiet certainty that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoring something she believed in. And I was just getting started. They didn't try to scare me with threats. They tried to wear me down with silence. The morning after Lydia filed the petition, my phone stopped ringing. Not just from Jared, but from everyone. No emails, no calls, not even the group chat that Marion used religiously to coordinate holidays and gossip. I watched the little typing dots vanish after I asked for a copy of the trust amendments. By noon, the isolation set in. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding together, even after Margaret's death. The phone calls I'd returned out of duty. The errands I ran. The hospital visits I coordinated long after Marion lost interest. It wasn't just about the will. I'd been their bridge to civility. Their human buffer. And now I was being erased. There's a particular coldness in being frozen out by people who still smile in public. The way their eyes skim past you at the grocery store. The way they don't correct the narrative when someone else repeats it wrong. I heard through a neighbor that Marion was calling me unstable. That she told people the stress of losing Margaret had made me delusional. That I was obsessed with money that was never promised to me. She knew exactly what she was doing. Not confronting me directly, that would give me something to push back against. No, she wanted me to feel like I was shouting into a void. Like the only response left was to back down. And it might have worked. If not for the one person who kept showing up. Nora wasn't loud. She never had been. We met 5 years ago at a garden supply shop when I dropped a flat of rosemary seedlings and she bent down without a word to help me gather them. We'd been quiet friends since, the kind built on steady gestures, not declarations. Tea on hard days. Car rides without small talk. Silence that didn't need to be filled. She stopped by that afternoon with a small brown box. She said, "It's just lemon shortbread. The kind your grandmother liked." I replied, "Thank you." We didn't talk about Marion. We didn't talk about court. But before she left, she placed a folded slip of paper on the counter. "I believe you." That note sat beside my laptop as I combed through old emails and messages for anything that might matter legally. The weight of memory is strange. You think you remember things clearly until you're forced to prove them. Dates blur. Conversations fold into each other. What felt certain becomes slippery under the pressure of evidence. But I kept going. There was the email from Margaret asking me to scan her medical directive. The receipt from the notary when we filed the original trust documents. The calendar entries I'd kept when scheduling her estate planning meetings, my initials in the corner of each one. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Still, the pressure mounted. Every time Lydia emailed with an update, my stomach knotted. Not because I feared losing, but because I feared becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who measured grief in exhibits and testimonies. Someone who had to defend love like it was a contract. That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of my refrigerator and the creak of old pipes, wondering if Marion ever cared at all. If she was simply incapable. Or if she knew, deep down, that Margaret had loved me in a way she'd never earned. Grief plays tricks like that. It takes the shape of doubt. It makes you question even the truest things. The following day, Jared showed up unannounced. He stood on the sidewalk in a pressed shirt and expensive shoes, holding a clipboard like some kind of peace offering. He said, "Let's be reasonable, Evelyn. This is family." I replied, "That's why I'm doing this." He looked confused. Or maybe offended that I hadn't asked him in for tea like before. He said, "It doesn't have to get ugly." I replied, "It already did." He left without further protest. But that afternoon, I received a letter from Marion's attorney claiming I had misrepresented the nature of my relationship to the deceased and that the trust had been lawfully amended under Margaret's full consent and capacity. It was phrased carefully. No accusations. Just enough to plant suspicion. I forwarded it to Lydia and waited. She called an hour later. She said, "They're trying to get ahead of the hearing. We'll need to subpoena the firm that handled the amendment." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Then she paused. And in her lawyerly, measured tone, said, "Just be prepared. If they fight this, it won't stay private." That was when it hit me. This wasn't going to be just about the trust anymore. They would go after my character. They would rake through everything, from my finances to my emotional health. They'd drag out every disagreement, every text, every moment that could be twisted into instability or selfishness. And they'd do it all while pretending to be concerned. The next morning, I received an email from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. He said, "I don't know what's true anymore. But I hope you're okay." I stared at it for a long time. It didn't matter whether he believed me. What mattered was how easy it was for people to question the quiet one. The dependable one. The one who didn't scream or demand or dramatize. Because people like Marion understand something that most don't: if you control the story, you control the sympathy. And she had decades of practice in spinning tales that made her the misunderstood caretaker. But this wasn't a story. It was a record. One Lydia was now compiling into a case. And I, for the first time in my life, had stopped apologizing for making people uncomfortable. There's a kind of loneliness in standing your ground that no one warns you about. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like hunger. Like cold wind under your skin. Like waking up every morning and choosing the harder road even when the easy one is paved with family smiles and half-truths. But it's also the first kind of freedom I've ever tasted. And it was beginning to change me. I stopped hoping they'd do the right thing. I started preparing for the moment they couldn't lie their way out of it. The transition wasn't dramatic. There was no speech. No sudden fury. Just a quiet shift, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. I began waking earlier, making lists before sunrise, mapping timelines, digging through files with the same precision Margaret taught me when I was 13 and balancing her checkbook by hand. Lydia called it pre-litigation diligence. I called it reclaiming the truth. I spent hours at the county clerk's office, requesting copies of filings, signatures, records Marion probably assumed were buried too deep to matter. I wore the same gray coat each time, brought my own coffee in a thermos, and kept my voice steady. Most people smiled at me, handed over paperwork, never realizing I was documenting a quiet war. Each folder I filled was its own kind of justice. Proof that Margaret hadn't been confused, as Marion implied. That her final months weren't clouded by frailty or suggestion. That her choices weren't made in error, but in clarity. One folder held her medical records, clean, consistent, no signs of cognitive impairment. Another contained a series of dated letters to her bank, shifting primary access to me months before the alleged amendment to the trust. The handwriting matched across every document. Lydia called it a pattern of intent. I called it her voice, still speaking, long after they tried to silence her. Still, the deeper I went, the more I began to understand what Marion was counting on. Not legal loopholes, but exhaustion. She thought I would run out of strength before she ran out of lies. That eventually, I'd stop showing up. That the cost of fighting her, emotionally, financially, would outweigh the inheritance itself. She didn't realize the money never mattered. The truth was the only thing that kept me going. But there was something else I hadn't expected, the clarity that came with distance. As I catalogued all the proof, I began to see the story of my life with Margaret from a new angle. Not just a series of tasks and sacrifices, but a relationship built on trust so intimate, it didn't need to be broadcast. Every grocery list, every appointment card, every birthday she remembered with my favorite tea or the hardback book she knew I wanted, it was all evidence. Not just in court, but in my bones. I stopped mourning what Marion stole. I started protecting what Margaret built. That change altered how I moved through each day. I stopped justifying my actions to people who never listened. I stopped replying to vague texts from cousins asking for both sides of the story. I deleted the group chat without announcing my exit. There's a kind of power in no longer explaining yourself. And in that silence, I found focus. Nora noticed the change first. She came by one evening with leftover soup and a bundle of winter herbs from her garden. She didn't say much, just sat at my kitchen table while I organized another set of exhibits for Lydia. After a long pause, she said, "You seem different." I replied, "I'm tired of shrinking to keep the peace." She nodded slowly, then reached over to move a teacup out of the way of my folder. It was such a small gesture. But something in it told me she understood. That she saw the version of me I was slowly becoming, the one who didn't ask for permission to take up space. That night, I opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it Timeline of Discrepancy. It began with the day Margaret first revised her trust, 2 years before her death. It ended with Marion's letter from her lawyer claiming the trust had been altered just 6 weeks prior to her passing, during a period when I had daily logs of Margaret's lucid and documented conversations with her accountant. Each bullet point was a small blade. Quiet. Precise. Lydia reviewed it the next day and said, "This will help more than you know." And still, even with all the preparation, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no gloating. Just a steady calm, like the stillness before a storm. Because I knew what was coming. Marion would not retreat. She'd dig deeper. Call in favors. Maybe even fabricate consent through a witness who was half asleep during the signing. She'd spin it into a narrative about duty, about maternal regret, about a granddaughter who manipulated an aging woman for her own gain. She might even believe it. People like her often do. But I was ready. Not for revenge. For clarity. There's a difference. And then, one afternoon, a letter arrived that shifted everything. Not from Marion. From the bank. It was a copy of a voicemail transcript Margaret left on their automated line, something I didn't know they documented. The date was 2 months before her death. The message said, "This is Margaret Whitlow. I want to confirm that only my granddaughter Evelyn should have access to account ending in 3471. No one else. Not even my daughter." It was short. Crackled with static. But it was unmistakably her voice. I listened to it 5 times. Then I emailed it to Lydia without a word. I didn't cry. I just sat very still in my chair, the weight of those words settling into my spine like armor. Because now, no matter what Marion claimed, we had Margaret, in her own voice, reaffirming the truth. And suddenly, the path ahead didn't feel so lonely. It felt inevitable. They didn't expect me to show up. And they certainly didn't expect me to show up calm. The courthouse conference room was colder than I imagined, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. A long polished table, recessed lights, and silence thick enough to weigh on your chest. Lydia had told me what to expect. But no one prepares you for the moment your family becomes your opposition on paper. Marion was already seated when we arrived. Jared stood behind her, arms crossed in that vaguely defensive posture he probably thought made him look authoritative. He nodded at me, not quite a greeting, not quite an acknowledgement. Just enough movement to remind me this was no longer personal to them. It was business. Her lawyer was younger than I expected. Polished, overconfident. The type who probably thought his job was to intimidate rather than resolve. I took my seat across from Marion. Lydia sat beside me, calm as ever, her folders arranged by category, financials, medical, correspondence. The court-appointed mediator introduced herself. Neutral, measured. She spoke like a therapist used to high-conflict couples. I wondered if she had any idea how deep this family fracture ran. We began with the basics. Dates. Documents. The amended trust Marion claimed reflected Margaret's final wishes. The timeline I'd compiled. The voicemail. The bank statements. The emails. Every fact placed gently on the table, like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Marion said nothing at first. She let her lawyer speak for her, his tone condescendingly warm. He said, "Our position is that the deceased made her intentions clear in the revised trust. We believe Ms. Whitlow was manipulated in her final months, and that certain family dynamics may have clouded her better judgment." I didn't look at him. I looked at Marion. She didn't blink. Lydia responded, her tone polite, clipped. She said, "We'll let the documentation speak for itself." Including the decedent's voice-confirmed instructions to her financial institution. And then she pressed play. The room went still. Margaret's voice crackled through the small speaker, calm, deliberate, unmistakable. When the clip ended, the only sound was Jared's shift in posture. Marion's expression didn't change. But her fingers, resting on the edge of the table, tensed. Her lawyer tried to recover, shifting to emotional grounds. He said, "Given the familial history here, it's understandable that tensions might lead to misinterpretation. Mrs. Whitlow may have felt isolated or pressured." I interrupted. Quietly. I said, "She wasn't isolated. I was with her every day." "You were not." The room stilled again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, he looked at Marion, waiting for direction. She finally spoke. She said, "You think you're owed everything because you played nurse." I didn't respond. She said, "She was my mother. You'll never understand what that means." Still, I said nothing. Because truth doesn't need a rebuttal. She continued, her voice sharper now. She said, "She changed the trust because she realized she was being used." I replied, "Then why was I the one holding her hand at the end?" Silence. Even Jared looked down. Lydia stepped in before the mediator could redirect. She said, "We're prepared to proceed to court if necessary. However, my client is willing to consider a settlement that honors the original trust and preserves dignity for both parties." Marian laughed, low, bitter. She said, "Dignity? You think this is about dignity?" Lydia didn't flinch. She said, "Yes. Because some of us still value that." And that was the shift. Not loud. Not immediate. But visible. Jared's arms fell to his sides. His jaw tightened. Marian turned slightly toward him, just enough for me to see the flicker of betrayal forming in his expression. She hadn't told him everything. Of course she hadn't. That's the thing about people like her, they manipulate one circle at a time. And hope the circles never compare notes. The mediator called for a brief recess. Lydia and I stepped into the hallway. I leaned against the wall and looked down at my shoes. Not out of nerves, just to remind myself I was still standing. She said, "You did well." I replied, "It doesn't feel like winning." She said, "It won't. Until it's over." When we returned, Marian looked different. Not broken, just slightly off balance. As if her grip on the narrative had finally loosened. Her lawyer cleared his throat. He said, "My clients are open to negotiation. In the interest of avoiding protracted litigation." I didn't speak. Lydia nodded once. Calm. Controlled. The next 20 minutes were a blur of numbers, percentages, concessions. I said little. Lydia said only what was necessary. Eventually, the mediator summarized the agreement. Margaret's house would remain in my name. The bulk of the investment account, the part allocated to long-term care and legacy, would transfer under my management as trustee. Marian would retain a portion of the non-liquid assets. Enough to save face. Enough to make her stop. It wasn't revenge. It was resolution. And yet, as we signed the paperwork, her voice found me one last time. She said, "You think this makes you better?" I replied, "No. Just not silent." She stood to leave. Jared followed, slower this time. And I sat there, pen still in hand, not triumphant, not relieved, just emptied. Because winning doesn't feel like justice when it costs you your history. It just feels like breath returning to your lungs after holding it too long. Victory doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence, and a list of things you'll never say out loud. I left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. No handshake. No eye contact. Lydia understood. She didn't ask if I wanted to debrief. She just pressed her hand lightly to my shoulder before heading in the opposite direction. Outside, the air felt sharper than it should have. Not cold. Just too crisp for comfort. I sat in my car for a long time, the envelope of signed documents on the passenger seat, unopened. They'd been copied and notarized and sealed. It was done. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a house after a funeral. Clean. Still. Echoing with a kind of grief that doesn't know where to go. I drove past Margaret's house but didn't stop. The porch was dark. Marian's car was gone. There was a small stack of flyers wedged into the mailbox slot, local takeout menus and lawn care advertisements. The kind of thing no one picks up unless they live there. I didn't remove them. Let the wind take them. Let the neighborhood forget. I went home and made tea. The routine felt mechanical, boil, steep, pour, but it grounded me. I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's recipe box open beside me, not reading anything, just letting my fingers rest on the lid. Somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., I realized I hadn't spoken aloud since the courthouse. I whispered one word. Enough. The next week came quietly. I returned to my part-time work at the library archives, sorting old letters, scanning records. It was a job no one envied and everyone forgot existed. I liked it. It didn't ask anything of me emotionally. It gave me space to move slowly, to breathe without justifying it. Nora brought soup again. We didn't talk about the case. She simply left it on the counter and sat with me while I organized Margaret's paperwork into new folders, one labeled Estate Complete, another Legacy Notes. She said, "Will you stay in the house?" I replied, "Not yet." I wasn't ready to walk through those rooms without her. But one morning, I did return. I let myself in with the spare key Lydia had insisted I reclaim from the estate attorney. There was dust on the banister. The scent of lavender had faded. But the bones of her life were still here, the framed stitching above the stove, the notebook by the window seat, the cracked teacup that she never had the heart to throw away. I moved slowly through the house, not to remember, but to understand. To see it not as a battleground, but as a woman's life preserved in quiet corners. I found her journal in the drawer of the nightstand. Not a diary. Just notes. Appointments, reflections, fragments of recipes she meant to try. On one page, in her small, slanted handwriting, she had written, "Evelyn has strength I didn't teach her. She came into the world with it." I closed the book and didn't cry. That was the difference now. Emotion no longer ran through me like a current I couldn't control. It came in manageable waves. It allowed me to sit, breathe, absorb, and move forward. Word of the settlement reached the rest of the family within days. There were no apologies. Just silence, the kind you get when people want to pretend something never happened, as though skipping a funeral absolves you of loss. One cousin emailed me. She said, "I hope things work out for you." I didn't reply. Because things didn't need to work out for me. They needed to stop being taken. I spent the next few weeks handling the residuals, switching utilities, setting up a trust account in Margaret's name for the local library she used to donate to, signing over the smaller assets Lydia negotiated into Marion's portion of the agreement. I didn't keep any of the furniture. I didn't keep her jewelry. Just the house, the letters, and her voice in that voicemail, the one I'd memorized, syllable by syllable. Jared called me once. He said, "I didn't know." About the voicemail. About the accounts. I replied, "You didn't want to know." He didn't argue. He just said, "She's not speaking to me." I said nothing. Because what was there to say? That betrayal costs more than money? That complicity feels clean until the fallout arrives? That silence is its own kind of signature? He hung up first. I haven't heard from him since. Lydia wrapped the last of the paperwork by late spring. We met one final time to sign and notarize the transfer of title. She offered to refer me to a financial advisor. I declined. Margaret had already taught me more than most professionals could. Before leaving, Lydia said, "If you ever need anything, you know where I am." I replied, "Thank you for letting me fight without falling apart." She said, "You didn't let me. You led." And just like that, we parted, two women who never pretended to be anything other than what we were. It took me 3 more weeks to move into the house. I brought very little, just clothes, books, and Margaret's tea set, wrapped in newspaper and packed inside a single crate. I painted the kitchen a soft shade of blue, the same color as the hydrangeas she loved but never could keep alive. On the first night, I sat on the back steps with a blanket and a mug of chamomile. I listened. No voices. No accusations. No lawyers. Just the sound of wind in the trees and a sense that, for the first time in years, no one could rewrite the story that brought me here. I wasn't healed. But I was whole. And in the stillness, I began to wonder, what does life look like when no one is waiting to take it from you? Some scars don't fade, they just stop bleeding. And sometimes, that's enough. It's been 6 months. The house no longer feels like a monument. It feels like a home again. My rhythm is slower now, deliberate, not cautious. I move through the rooms without flinching. I've repainted the hallway, replaced the old stove with something Margaret would have called too fancy, and hung one of her needlework pieces above the front door. Do the next right thing. I kept her handwriting intact in the frame. Visitors assume it's a quote from somewhere else. But I know it's hers. And I don't correct them. Some things don't need to be explained. I started volunteering again. Back at the clinic where I met Lydia. This time in estate advocacy. Helping people like Margaret navigate what they think they'll never need to worry about, until someone decides to rewrite their lives when they can no longer speak. I've learned that betrayal doesn't always come with fangs. Sometimes it arrives with a smile and a handshake. Sometimes it wears perfume and carries the same last name. But I've also learned that truth is not fragile. It survives silence. It survives shame. It even survives family. People still ask what happened between me and Marion. Mostly neighbors. A few old friends who pretend not to know. I answer with quiet honesty, nothing embellished, nothing withheld. Just the simple shape of events. Some nod with sympathy. Some don't know what to say. But I don't carry it around anymore like a burden. It's just a part of what made me. Jared never reached out again. I heard he moved to another firm out of state. Marion still owns a property 2 towns over. But she doesn't come here. I see her name occasionally in the community newsletter under some donation or foundation involvement. She's still performing. I no longer take it personally. Because her version of the story doesn't hold weight anymore. Not here. Not in this house. Not in my mind. I keep Margaret's letters in a small cedar box on the dresser. I don't read them often. I don't need to. I know what they say. But once in a while, when the air feels too quiet and the world a little too sharp, I open the lid and let the scent of old paper and lavender remind me of where I come from. I've stopped asking why she didn't tell me sooner about the trust amendments. Or why she didn't confront Marion directly. The older I get, the more I understand that people like Margaret chose their battles carefully. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. She knew who Marion was. But she also knew who I could become. And maybe that was the plan all along. Not to shield me from the ugliness, but to give me a reason to rise through it. To teach me that dignity isn't inherited, it's chosen, again and again, even when no one's watching. One morning, I planted new roses in the backyard. Red. Fragrant. The kind that doesn't look like much the first season but survives the frost and comes back stronger. Nora helped dig the holes. We didn't talk much. Just worked side by side, sipping water and pointing out where the light hit best. She said, "It's good to see you, here." I replied, "It's good to feel it." That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sun lower behind the trees, casting gold across the front steps Margaret swept every Sunday without fail. I realized I hadn't thought about the court case in days. It wasn't forgotten, just folded away. Like a letter read too many times, the ink faded but still legible. I don't know what legacy really means. But I think it's this: a quiet house, a steady life, and a name that means something because of how you carried it. Not because of what you were given. But because of what you refused to let be taken. And as the wind shifted through the garden, I heard her again, not as a ghost, but as a presence. Not words. Just a knowing. The fight was never about the will. It was about mine. And I'm finally living it.